It's a pleasure now to introduce Dr. Rhidian Griffiths. Rhidian is known to you as the president of the Welsh-language Society, which is seeking to increase interest in the hymn and tunes in Wales. Rhidian is interested in many aspects of musical history in Wales, including hymnology and congregational singing, and published much in that field. So it's good to be able to welcome him warmly to discuss the Anglicans and the hymn in the 17th and 18th centuries. So thank you very much, Rhidian, and a very warm welcome. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for the welcome and the invitation and the opportunity to be with you tonight. And thank you, those who are listening, for being here. Well, already in this series, Dr. Rhidian Morgan has shown us what the extent of Edmund Prees' his contribution was in creating the metrical psalms in 1621. And we were reminded that this has been an influence throughout the centuries, with the many editions showing how useful the metrical psalms were in Anglican services. And this is the foundation of Welsh hymnology, really. Well, usually the metrical psalms were published with the prayer book, and the prayer book set the pattern of church services. In the 17th and 18th centuries, there wasn't much scope within the established church to develop hymn singing beyond the metrical psalms. And yet, in this period, some hymns grew out of the ecclesiastical tradition directly. In 1662, during the Restoration in England, a new prayer book was published, and Welsh-language edition was published in 1664. And since creating the first prayer book in 1549, in the service for ordaining priests, there was an English version of the Latin hymn, Veni Creator Spiritus, that is, Come Holy Ghost, eternal God proceeding from above, to be sung or to be said in terms of a litany, and with the leader speaking with the congregational antiphonally. Well, there was added later a more concise version on the basis of the same hymn, giving you a choice of two. The concise verse by John Cosin, Come Holy Ghost, our souls empire, enlighten with celestial fire, a version which is still sung regularly. The Dr. Brynley Roberts suggests that the long version is closest to the Latin, but Cosin has expressed the spirit of the original just as effectively. The 1664 prayer book, which including an ordination service in Welsh for the first time, included translations of both forms of the English hymn, is not certain that who was the translator, but Roland Vychan is actually believed in tradition to have compiled both, and he published a Welsh version of the practice of piety. Well, this is the concise form, has become one of the classics of Welsh hymnology and hymnody, and is included in our hymn books without much change at all. The 1664 version isn't very different from what we know today for practical reasons. That the Spirit Glân Tragwyddol Dduw, which is the translation of the long form, which is 16 verses in full, hasn't had such a welcome as a congregational hymn, even though it remained in the hymn books of the Church in Wales and the 1927 Methodist book as 5 verses. Here it is here. But, this has been overtaken really by the concise version. And if you look at the where the hymn appears in the prayer book, we see that both forms, one comes after the other. There's a choice for whoever is leading the service that the two forms are there in terms of an antiphonal liturgy. You can see that there, the bold print, and the response comes afterwards. So it's not a congregational hymn as it is presented there, but the description above the hymn says that the hymn may be sung or spoken by the bishop and the ordinance. So there's a choice there between speaking and singing there, and that's been there from the beginning of this service. But if it was sung on what tunes, we don't know. But it's worth noticing that Ronald Vychan, or whoever translated these, had chosen the psalm meter, one of the tunes which had become associated with Edmund Priest's metrical psalms might have been used. But we have no evidence of that. And these were hymns for special occasions, ordaining priests or bishops. But through the prayer book, another classic hymn came to us, even though that wasn't an official service. In 1710, at the request of the bishops of Wales and Hereford, and Ellis Wynn, from Lars Innes, we've heard about him already, produced a new version of a prayer book and included a hymn within the prayer book with this apologetic introduction that he thought that it wouldn't be because there was a blank page. He felt he could stuff his hymn there. Well, we had a classic of a hymn, which is I Am the Grace Resurrection, in the psalm meter. Maybe singing in the meter of the metrical sounds actually gave some status to the words, and maybe Ellis Wynn felt that this was the proper meter for hymn, and the tunes for the metrical sounds were available. This develops the Calvinistic concept that only the scriptural words should be sung in church. These words aren't a direct metrical version of the scripture, but you will note that Ellis Wynn, in the notes scriptural references to every verse. So he sets the hymn within the tradition of the metrical psalms. So it's an extension of the metrical psalm system. But it was a hymn to be sung in a funeral or a vigil beyond the framework of the Book of Prayer. So to be sung in the open air at a funeral or on in the home of the deceased. It's interesting how Lewis Morris talks about the vigils happening in Anglesey in the 18th century.
Read by the clergyman of the parish, or if not present, by one of the company. The singing of psalms, if they can, or else fall to singing of carols, which are ancient songs containing reflections on death, etc., and immortality of the soul.
Now, Ellis Wynne wasn't opposed to carols. He produced Plugine carols himself. And the psalm meter is a carol meter. But was this hymn an attempt to bring a new a new solemnity to the vigil? I don't know if these were produced by Ellis Wynne, but these are metrical versions of the ecclesiastical canticles, Te Deum, the Venite, the Magnificat, etc. And these seem to represent a halfway between the prose canticles in the service and a congregational hymn, and these on the psalm meter again to be sung. If you look on, there are 2 pages of these hymns. There's a hymn which is certainly not by Ellis Wynne, the lament of a sinner. Do not turn your face away from me, which was Ronald Vychan's translation of the Lamentation of the Sinners, a popular Welsh English song. Is the presence of these metrical versions and the hymns of Roland Vychan, do these suggest that there was a movement towards more congregational singing? Were they included in that version, the 7010 version of the Book of Prayer? Were they used in Ellis Wynne's churches? Were they used elsewhere? Were they sung on the psalm meter tunes? But a note above Roland Vychan's hymn says to be sung as the 6th psalm, so on a tune which is suggested by Edward Pries for the metrical version of the 6th psalm. And the psalm meter was chosen by Roland Vychan for his translation, even though that wasn't the meter of the original English hymn. But whatever however these hymns in the 1710 Book of Common Prayer were used, the fact that they're included in the Book of Common Prayer suggests that there was a feeling that more could be done than just singing metrical psalms in the services. But if there was a doubt whether these hymns would be sung at all, we do have evidence of singing on the fringes of the church from 1721, and the work by Erasmus Saunders, View of the State of Religion in the Diocese of St David's. Quite a sad description, or many of you who have read this, of the situation of the church at the time. But in the middle of all this talk about the failings of the church, there is a section about singing whole sings, and now these are not hymns as such, but interesting for me is the way Erasmus Saunders describes what happens. Young people in the church coming together and singing.
It is not to be expressed what a particular delight and pleasure the young people take to get these hymns by heart and to sing them, with a great deal of emulation of excelling each other, and this is a religious exercise they are used to, as well at home in their own houses as upon some public occasions such as their wakes and solemn festivals and funerals.
The same kind of thing that Alice were not suggesting. But this is interesting. The words are put in red.
Very frequently in their churches in the winter season, between All Saints and Candlemas, at which times before and after divine service,
that is beyond the confines of the surface.
On Sundays or holy days, 8 or 10 will commonly divide themselves to 4 or 5 other side, and so forming themselves as it were into an imitation of our cathedral or collegiate choirs. One party first begins, and then by way of alternate responses, the other repeats the same.
That is, it was some kind of attempt to create a form of singing which is informal and yet has a formal shape to it. That description is very interesting, although it doesn't describe congregational singing, strictly speaking. But there was no doubt that music was still happening in the churches at this time. Prose psalms and metrical psalms. There's a reference to teachers of psalm singing. But generally, we feel that it wasn't a very good quality. I wonder if the singing of the ecclesial choirs, which is Samuel Hieronymus Grimm, a satirical depiction of a choir, everybody shouting across each other, and William Morris says in 1746. So
is almost quite over with us at the head.
You're talking about Holyhead, that psalmody was finished in Holyhead. And I wonder if Edmund Priest's metrical psalms actually was acceptable to the congregations every time. Lewis Morris says,
whose British version of the singing psalms is the only one we ever used in churches, chose rather to preserve the old measure.
And when he says the old measure, that he's using the tunes on what's called the common measure, even though he wrote in the psalm meter. So they were set to the wrong meter for singing, in a way, because editors have actually worked on Edmund Priest's wording to make it fit more to the tunes today. There seems to have been a problem earlier on. But one of the great contributions of the church to the community life then, as you've heard in the first session tonight, was the work, or in another session of these talks, was the work of the circular schools and Griffith Jones. And Griffith Jones' main aim was saving souls. And it was the Bible and the Catechism that people learned to read. But there is a suggestion that some of the schools used the metrical psalms, believing that singing the truths of the faith could be just as effective as reading about them. And Griffith Jones had an interest in the hymn as a form of worship. In 1743, he published a selection of Edmund Priest's metrical psalms for use in schools, and in one of the annual reports on the schools of Welsh piety, he talks about buying 4,000 books of singing psalms. Probably that's a selection for 9p each, and in 1745 he published The Song of Zion, which was about praising God in psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. although it's more about the reasons for worshipping God rather than any practical sessions about the use of psalms and hymns. But the rules of the schools in the same year, 1745, notes that the scholars must sing psalms and pray to God every morning and evening in the schools. Considering the thousands of children and adults who were involved in the schools, even not every school was singing, we can believe that this practice helped to make them more well known and set the scene for the hymn singer came later. And the 18th century is the 18th century thought of as the century of hymn in Wales because of the Methodist revival from 1735 onwards, and especially in the contribution of William Williams, Pantycelyn. Now, the Methodist hymn deserves a separate discussion, but I just want to note that the leaders of the Methodist movement were committed Anglicans, and part of their aim was to try to revive the Anglican Church. And Pantycelyn himself, a deacon who was never priested, was an Anglican himself, of course. Even though that he worked on the fringes, that his hymns became popular on the fringes of the church, the Methodists, Zodias, etc. And it became to his full development from 1762 onwards, with classical hymns which are sung in all denominations in Wales. And Pantycelyn wasn't the only Anglican to produce hymns. Morgan Rhys, one of the teachers at Griffiths Jones's schools, was a hymn writer and an Anglican as well, and we could add many other names. And an un-Methodist name in this context is Goranwy Owen, and he made one translation of a hymn by the Presbyterian Samuel Collett, and Professor Wyn James has researched the hymn and suggested that he saw Collett's hymn in a Gentleman magazine 1754 and then produced his translation soon after. Well, we can't call Gronwy's hymn a well-known one unless, like myself, you were brought up on the Methodist hymn 1927, Trydroi'r Ryd Ewen Aywg. But one thing which is interesting is that he chose to write in the psalm meter again. That's a different meter to the original hymn by Collett. I wonder if there's suggested here that it is the psalm meter that was the right one for the ecclesiastical hymn. The hymn was included in the 1927 book because John Morris Jones was the chair of the literary committee of the book, and the classical nature of the hymn appealed to him. Well, unfortunately the hymn has become forgotten these days. There's a very ancient classical taste to it. And of course Thomas Charles, another Anglican, was with his great hymn that the great intention of eternal love was full salvation, which he wrote following his own illness. well, there's some people. One thing which is interesting here, that Thomas Charles, even though he uses the 8787 double meter, uses another version of the 87 meter, which is what we see in Griffiths hymns, and there are some lines with there's an extra syllable, and as the accenting in Edmund Peace's work has caused problems for congregations, and similarly Thomas Charles's additions can trip up some singers, and Morgan Rhys and Anne Griffiths and Pantycelyn themselves were doing this. It was shown years ago that this extended meter actually was related to the ballad form, such as y ferch y blwydd Penderyn. I wonder if the fact that Anne Griffiths and Morgan Rhys, who lived in very different areas of Wales, and Thomas Charles and Pantycelyn, all could use this extended meter, suggests that some folk tunes were also a background to the hymnody of the time. And this great explosion in hymn production in the end of the 18th century did have its effect on the church, and the success of the Methodists and their singing in 1770 version of the Book of Common Prayer included tunes for the psalm meter. And then in 1795, two collections in Welsh and in English were produced for Beaumaris Church, and the notes on this copy in the National Library suggest that it was produced by the Reverend Richard Griffiths, Rector of Llandegwen and Beaumaris had produced it. It includes 153 metrical psalms and hymns from other traditions as well as the Anglican one, and the Welsh collection is smaller, but it includes the metrical psalms and hymns, 10 psalms, not Edmund Peace's versions, all of them, and 14 hymns, including the work of Davies Jones Cayo and Benjamin Francis, who were nonconformist hymn writers. And the fact that these books were put together and published tells us how the hymn is becoming a natural part of the Anglican service by the end of the 18th century. Before you ask me, I don't know what wrong book that has been corrected signifies. But there another collection was published in 1799 for a Llanbeblig church, which was a more extended version. Notice the title. These were hymns and anthems which are regularly used. So this has become part of the service. So there is 33 general hymns and 13 hymns on particular occasions, and from various sources, with the Tyd Ysbryd Glân from the 64 prayer book, David Jones of Gayo was here, Williams Pantycelyn, and a number of hymns that I don't recognise who their author is. Some of them on plug-in type meters. We don't know what tunes were used. but we can imagine that so many tunes had come from England through the Methodists, and they may have been traditional Welsh tunes used as well. And the size of these books suggests that they were used by a congregation. They're small. They're easy to keep in the pocket. The signatures on their front pages suggest that they were owned by private individuals. People would put their names and the date on them, and probably there were other collections for other churches which have not survived. Well, by 1820, the church was ready to include a hymn as part of the service. So the Archbishop of Canterbury officially put his seal on the collection of hymns for the church from the 19th century onwards. Official collections of hymns were produced by the Anglican Church in Wales, and even though they included some very devotionally oriented hymns, they were a national collection of hymns. They included quite a happy mixture together, remembering that one of the intentions of the early Methodists were to revive the Anglican Church, and that the success of the Methodists in getting people to sing made the church accept the hymn. Those early leaders had succeeded in one way anyway, to bring new life to the old mother, the Anglican Church. Well, thank you so much, Rhidian. Extremely interesting again, hearing that history, the development of the hymn. It struck me at the beginning that the hymn was something quite marginal in the church. Is it an example of a church with quite a strict liturgy, which is regulated by the Crown from London, and not much flexibility and ability to be creative? So the hymn becomes an opportunity for people to enjoy worshipping God, and gives them some kind of freedom, and then seeing the nonconformists developing with more freedom, without the same regulation in terms of the form of the surface, and the importance of the hymn grows as some kind of more creative expression of worship. Well, surely you're right that the church began with something that had been set, and the church followed that regularly. There was no place really then for him, and there wasn't much need, because there was enough congregational involvement in the service. But what the Methodists in particular was developed the idea of the congregation responding to the sermon in particular. It was an expression of worship and a response, and that influenced the church, because the church maybe saw the success and saw that there was room within the framework of the Book of Roman Prayer without setting it aside. There was a place for hymns, and of course you see the metrical sounds from Peace earlier on, and then versions of the Mighty and the Magnificent and Te Deum, etc. They gave a new life, perhaps, to the canticles that were sung within the liturgy, but giving them a new musical life, and that still happens. hymn writers are still doing that today. But it was even wider than that. It's interesting the relationship between the formal liturgy and the drawings from the hymns.